In the heart of an affluent city, where designer handbags and polished smiles reign supreme, Karen Whitman has crafted her perfect empire. Her latest venture, a luxury event space called the Velvet Garden, is designed to exude exclusivity, a haven for the rich and influential. But when a homeless man quietly takes a seat on a park bench outside her pristine venue, Karen sees him as more than an inconvenience. To her, he's a stain on her vision, a disruption to her perfect world. What begins as a single confrontation spirals into an outrageous display of entitlement, leaving Karen's reputation and her empire shattered in a single day. Subscribe now to watch her perfect empire implode. Karen Whitman strode into the park early that morning, her heels clicking against the cobblestone path. With its manicured flower beds, gold-accented benches, and shimmering fountains, the space was everything she envisioned. An oasis of opulence that she planned to debut as a luxury event venue. "I told you, Greg," Karen said to her husband, gesturing dramatically at the park. "This is going to be the destination for the wealthy. Business meetings, influencer brunches, charity galas. This space will finally bring some class to this town." Greg, trailing behind her, raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's a public park. Are you sure people will buy into a rich-only vibe when anyone can come here?" Karen stopped mid-step, spinning around to face him. "That's the point. I'm rebranding this space. I have exclusive contracts with the city for private events. If anyone dares to show up and ruin the aesthetic—" She trailed off, narrowing her eyes at the thought. "Let's just say they won't stick around for long." Greg sighed. "You're turning a park into a velvet rope lounge. Just don't lose your mind when someone doesn't fit your perfect little image." Karen waved him off dismissively. "People know better than to mess with me." Except as Karen rounded the corner near the centerpiece fountain, her perfectly planned morning came to a screeching halt. A man was sitting on one of the pristine new benches, a man who did not belong. He had a tattered backpack at his feet and wore a faded jacket over jeans that were frayed at the edges. A cardboard sign propped up against the bench read, "Just trying to get back on my feet. Anything helps." Karen froze, her jaw tightening. "Unbelievable," she hissed. The man looked up from the sandwich he was eating and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression calm. "That's it," Karen muttered. "This park is for respectable people, not this." Greg grabbed her arm lightly. "Karen, let it go. He's not hurting anyone." Karen ignored him and stormed forward, her voice sharp and cold. "Excuse me, do you realize you're sitting in a newly renovated park? This isn't some cheap rest stop." The man glanced up, confused but polite. "I'm not bothering anyone, my doubt," he said. "I'm just sitting here." Karen's lips curled. "Sitting here? On one of the benches I personally helped restore?" She shook her head in mock disbelief. "Do you think people want to come here and see this?" The man frowned, but remained calm. "This is a public park, isn't it? I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Karen's nostrils flared. She turned to Greg. "Call security." "Karen, no," Greg said firmly. "You're being ridiculous. Just let it go." Her gaze snapped back to the man. "If you don't leave, I'll have someone remove you. Your choice." He sighed, gathering his things. "I'll move to another bench," he muttered. Karen crossed her arms, watching him shuffle to a spot farther down the path. "The nerve of some people," she muttered, already pulling out her phone to call Ellen, her event manager, and rant about the disruption. The Velvet Garden preview party was in full swing. The string quartet played softly in the background, while waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne and canapes. Guests mingled in their designer suits and cocktail dresses, exchanging pleasantries about real estate, stock portfolios, and their next luxury vacations. Karen Whitman should have been basking in the glory of her triumph, but she couldn't, because he was there. The man from earlier that morning, the homeless man who had dared to sit on one of her benches, was back. He wasn't in the middle of the event, but the audacity of him returning to the park, sitting on a bench near the fountain as if he belonged, was enough to make her blood boil. This time, he had a book in his hands, quietly reading as the party swirled around him. "He's taunting me now," Karen hissed under her breath, her manicured nails digging into the arm of her event manager, Ellen. "Karen," Ellen began cautiously, glancing nervously at the man. "He's just sitting there. People are having a good time. Maybe we should let it go?" Karen turned to Ellen, her eyes icy. "Let it go? Ellen, I have put months of work and a small fortune into making this event perfect. Do you think my guests want to see that? He is ruining the aesthetic. If you're not going to do something about it, I will." Ellen hesitated. "Karen, if you make a scene—" Karen's voice dropped, venom dripping from every word. "Are you questioning me, Ellen? Because if you are, I'll find someone else to manage this event." Ellen swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll get security," she mumbled, walking away. But even as Ellen left, Karen wasn't satisfied. Security would take too long, and she wanted the man gone now. She wanted him to feel humiliated for daring to disrupt her perfect world. Karen adjusted the hem of her silk dress and marched toward the fountain, her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone path. Heads turned as she walked, her movements purposeful and theatrical. She wanted people to watch. The man looked up as Karen approached, his face calm but wary. "I thought I made myself clear this morning," Karen said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "This park is not for loitering, especially not during my event." The man set his book down on his lap. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said evenly. "I'm just sitting here." Karen let out a sharp laugh. "Sitting here? On one of the benches I personally restored? Do you have any idea how much money went into this park? How much effort I've put into creating a space for respectable people?" The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Karen took a step closer, her voice rising. "This is a private event for people who belong here, people who contribute to society. You clearly don't belong, and if you had any self-respect, you'd leave." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests began murmuring to each other, but no one stepped in. They simply watched, some uncomfortable, others curious. The man stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "This is a public park," he said, his tone still calm. "You don't own it." Karen's smile turned sharp. "Oh, but I own this event, and I promise you, you will regret making a scene here." She turned to the crowd, her voice theatrical now. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" The chatter died down, all eyes on Karen. "This event represents elegance, class, and exclusivity," she declared, gesturing to the opulent setup around her. "It's about creating a space where the best of society can gather and enjoy beauty and sophistication. But unfortunately, not everyone understands the importance of maintaining standards." Karen pointed at the man. "Do you see this? This is what happens when standards aren't enforced. We lose everything we've worked for, everything we value. Do we want this park to become a haven for people like him?" The man's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mask of humiliation. But he didn't speak. He simply stood there, letting Karen's words wash over him. Karen smirked, turning back to the crowd. "I think we can all agree that it's time for him to leave." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. A few guests shifted uneasily, but no one spoke up. No one defended him. Finally, Karen stepped closer to the man, her voice dropping to a cold whisper only he could hear. "Go, before I call the police again." The man's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Karen. He exhaled slowly, picked up his book, and slung his tattered backpack over his shoulder. Without another word, he walked away, his back straight, but his head bowed. Karen watched him go, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. She turned back to the crowd, raising her glass of champagne as if nothing had happened. "Now," she said brightly, "let's get back to enjoying the party, shall we?" The guests slowly returned to their conversations, though the mood was noticeably subdued. Karen didn't care. In her mind, she had won. She spent the rest of the afternoon basking in the success of her event, oblivious to the whispered criticisms that began circulating among her guests. For Karen, the man was already forgotten. But for everyone else, the image of her cruelty lingered. The Velvet Garden preview had wrapped up without a hitch, at least as far as Karen Whitman was concerned. She leaned back in the plush seat of her luxury SUV, sipping sparkling water from a crystal tumbler as her driver navigated the evening traffic. The day had been stressful, yes, but Karen felt victorious. She had rid the park of that man, a blemish on her otherwise perfect event, and had successfully showcased her vision of exclusivity and elegance. To celebrate, she instructed her driver to stop at Rosetta's Bistro, a trendy wine bar just a few blocks away from the park. Karen envisioned a quiet evening of champagne and small plates, basking in the glow of her success. "I deserve this," she muttered to herself as the car pulled up. The bistro was packed, but Karen was immediately given a corner table, as if the universe itself acknowledged her importance. She ordered her usual, a glass of vintage champagne, and settled in, idly scrolling through her phone. But as she took a sip of her drink, something caught her eye through the large window facing the street. It was him, the homeless man. Karen's lips curled in disbelief. There he was, standing outside a small consignment shop across the street. The dim lighting of the shop illuminated his worn jacket and scuffed shoes as he stepped inside. "Unbelievable," Karen muttered, setting her glass down with a clink. The nerve of that man, returning to the area after everything she'd done to make it clear he wasn't welcome. And now he was loitering in a shop? Her blood began to boil at the thought of him disrupting another space. Without a second thought, Karen grabbed her purse and marched out of the bistro. The consignment shop, Merrick's Finds, was a modest boutique filled with curated secondhand items, vintage clothes, antique trinkets, and pre-owned jewelry. Karen pushed through the glass door, the bell above jingling sharply as she entered. The man was at the back of the store, looking at a display of watches. Karen's heels clicked loudly against the wooden floor as she approached, her expression dark. "You!" she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at him. The man looked up, startled. "What? What do you think you're doing in here?" Karen demanded, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the shopkeeper and a couple of other customers. "I'm just looking," the man said calmly, turning his attention back to the watches. Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "Looking? Or stealing? Because I can't imagine someone like you has the means to buy anything in a place like this." The man turned to face her fully now, his face hardening. "You need to back off. I'm not stealing anything." Karen let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please. People like you don't just look in shops like this. You're probably planning to pocket something the second no one's watching." The shopkeeper, a young woman with short blonde hair, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" "Yes, there's a problem," Karen said sharply, gesturing toward the man. "This man doesn't belong here. You should check your cameras and make sure he hasn't already taken something." The shopkeeper's eyes darted between Karen and the man, clearly unsure how to respond. The man took a step closer to Karen, his voice low and steady. "You don't know anything about me, lady. You've been on my case all day, and I've done nothing to you. I'm just trying to live my life." "Your life?" Karen sneered, her voice rising. "You call this a life? Sitting in parks, wandering into stores where you can't afford anything, ruining spaces that weren't meant for you?" She gestured toward his tattered clothes. "You're a walking disaster, a leech." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Karen's voice turned crueler, louder, enough to make the other customers wince. "People like you are the reason the world is falling apart. You don't work, you don't contribute, and yet you think you're entitled to everything. It's disgusting." "Ma'am, please," the shopkeeper began, but Karen cut her off. "No, I will not calm down. Someone needs to say it. People like him think they can just exist wherever they want without consequence. Well, not in my world." Karen reached for the glass of champagne she'd carried from the bistro, which she had set down on a nearby counter. Before anyone could stop her, she flung the contents at the man's face. The liquid splashed across his cheeks, soaking his jacket and the display case behind him. A collective gasp echoed through the store. The man froze, blinking away the champagne as it dripped from his hair and chin. He exhaled slowly, his hands shaking at his sides. Karen's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. "Now maybe you'll think twice about wandering into places you don't belong." The shopkeeper stepped forward, her face pale with shock. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." Karen turned to her, incredulous. "Excuse me? I'm the one trying to protect your store." The shopkeeper didn't flinch. "I don't care. What you just did was completely out of line. Leave, or I'll call the police." Karen's smirk faltered, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Fine, I'll leave, but don't come crying to me when he robs you blind." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the shop, the bell above the door jingling violently as it swung shut behind her. Back at the bistro, Karen sat down with a dramatic huff, ordering another glass of champagne as if nothing had happened. She scrolled through her phone, already mentally erasing the man from her mind. But inside the shop, the atmosphere was tense. The shopkeeper handed the man a towel to dry himself off, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry," she said. "That woman is unhinged." The man wiped his face and nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's fine," he said quietly. But his tone suggested otherwise. He picked up his backpack, glanced at the watches one last time, and left without another word. Karen, sitting smugly at her table with her second glass of champagne, didn't realize that her actions had just set the stage for her own undoing. The morning after the event, Karen Whitman woke up with the smug satisfaction of victory. She stretched luxuriously in her king-sized bed, the soft sunlight filtering through the silk curtains. The chaos of the previous day felt like a distant memory, her actions justified in her mind. She had defended her standards, protected her reputation, and ensured her vision of exclusivity remained intact. The incident at the shop had only cemented her belief that people like that man didn't belong in her world. As she sipped her morning coffee, Karen felt untouchable. That was until Greg stormed into the room. "What the hell did you do yesterday?" Greg's voice was sharp, a tone Karen rarely heard from her husband. Karen looked up from her tablet, frowning. "What are you talking about, Greg? I had a very successful event, if you hadn't noticed." Greg threw his phone onto the bed. "Have you seen this?" Karen grabbed the phone, her annoyance growing. The screen displayed a news article with the headline, "Socialite Karen Whitman sparks outrage for humiliating acclaimed philanthropists." Her stomach tightened as she scrolled. There were photos of her pointing at the man during the event, videos of her tirade in the shop, and worst of all, a still of the moment she flung champagne in his face. Below the images, the article revealed the man's identity: Dr. Thomas Evanston. Karen's jaw dropped as she read the description: a former tenured professor, best-selling author, and philanthropist who had fallen on hard times after using his savings to open shelters and literacy programs for underprivileged communities. His financial ruin was the result of legal battles with corrupt business partners who had defrauded him, leaving him penniless. Yet even in homelessness, he remained an advocate for social change, often speaking at events to bring attention to the very issues Karen had mocked him for. Karen's face burned as she read the final lines of the article. Dr. Evanston's dignity, in the face of Karen Whitman's cruelty, has sparked widespread condemnation of the socialite, with many calling for boycotts of her upcoming business ventures. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. "Ellen. Karen. You need to do damage control. This is bad." Becky. "That man wasn't just homeless. I can't believe what you did." Event sponsor. "We're pulling out of the Velvet Gardens launch. We can't be associated with this kind of controversy." Karen's throat tightened. She switched to social media, hoping to dismiss it all as an overreaction. Instead, she found her name trending. Hashtag Karen Whitman Exposed was everywhere. Tweets and posts flooded in, calling her out for her entitlement and cruelty. Clips of her confrontation with Dr. Evanston were circulating, edited with captions like, "This is what unchecked privilege looks like," and "The audacity of the wealthy." Comments poured in under every video. At Justice Rising, she humiliated a man who's done more for society than she ever will. Shameful. At Classless Karen. Karen Whitman has shown her true colors. Let's make sure no one supports her elitist nonsense. Voice for the voiceless. Dr. Evanston deserved respect, not this vile treatment. People like Karen are the problem. Karen's fingers trembled as she tossed the phone aside. Greg stood by the door, arms crossed. You need to fix this. Now. Karen's voice cracked. Fix it? Greg, these people don't understand what happened. They're twisting it into something it's not. Greg let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because from where I'm standing, they're calling it exactly what it was. You humiliated a good man, publicly, for no reason other than your warped sense of superiority. Karen's temper flared. I didn't know who he was. Does it matter? Greg shot back. What if he hadn't been anyone important? Would it have been okay to treat him like that? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss. Greg shook his head and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Karen reached out to her PR manager, Sophia. Within an hour, they had a strategy in place. A carefully crafted apology to release online, and a plan to meet with Dr. Evanston privately to make amends. It's all about optics, Karen, Sophia said over the phone. If you appear sincere, people might forgive you. Karen gritted her teeth. The idea of apologizing to the man she had berated made her stomach churn, but she knew she had no choice. The meeting was arranged at a community center where Dr. Evanston occasionally volunteered. Karen arrived in her SUV, dressed in an understated blouse and slacks, an attempt to look humble, though the diamond earrings and designer handbag undermined the effort. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. A few volunteers gave her sharp glances as she entered, their judgment palpable. Dr. Evanston was seated at a folding table, surrounded by stacks of books and pamphlets. When Karen approached, he looked up, his expression neutral, but tired. Dr. Evanston, Karen began, forcing a tight smile, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. He gestured to the chair across from him. Let's hear it, Mrs. Whitman. Karen hesitated, suddenly unsure of herself. The usual confidence in her voice faltered. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you. It was unacceptable, and I deeply regret my actions. Dr. Evanston's gaze didn't waver. Why do you regret it, Mrs. Whitman? Because you feel bad about what you did, or because the world is watching? Karen's cheeks flushed. I regret it because it was wrong, truly. Do you? He asked quietly, leaning forward. Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear? Karen's composure cracked. Look, I'm trying to make this right. I didn't know who you were, okay? If I'd known... Dr. Evanston raised a hand, silencing her. That's the problem, Mrs. Whitman. You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I was worthless. You assumed my life didn't matter because of how I looked, because I didn't fit into your little bubble of privilege. Karen's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent as he continued. You saw someone struggling and decided I was beneath you. That's not an apology you can fix with words. It's a mindset you need to unlearn. The room felt stiflingly quiet. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't need your apology, Dr. Evanston said finally, standing. And I don't need your redemption arc. What I need is for people like you to stop making life harder for people like me. If you really want to make this right, start with that. Karen stared at him, speechless, as he walked away. By the end of the week, Karen's world had imploded. Sponsors and investors for the Velvet Garden had pulled out entirely, citing her behavior incompatible with our values. Local organizations publicly distanced themselves, and even her socialite friends stopped returning her calls. Dr. Evanston, meanwhile, became the center of a wave of support. Donations flooded in for the shelters and programs he had once run, and his story became a symbol of resilience against systemic prejudice. Karen, once a queen of her social circles, was left isolated and humiliated. She had built her world on the illusion of exclusivity, but in the end, it was her own narrow-mindedness that destroyed her. Sitting alone in her empty mansion, Karen finally understood that her fall from grace wasn't just a fluke. It was inevitable. If you stand against racial injustice, type "justice" in the comments and share your voice below.